fabulous. And thank you. I also will be brief. We have got until 4 o'clock, but I'll be finishing at about 5 to 4. Welcome. My name is Tamsin Russell. I'm a member of the HVG Executive Board, but I'm here today talking about the work that we've done at the Museums Association, using us as a case study. But ultimately, what I want to achieve in the time that we've got together, if I can move my slide on. I'm just going to go to session aims, Rhiannon, is I'd like you to become more confident about how to approach measuring diversity within your volunteer populations. As part of this, I want to get you to reflect and understand a little bit more about the ethical legal requirements of doing so. And then how can we use these measures ultimately to transform your volunteering experience and create a more effective volunteering model for your organisations? It says Q&A at the end. If we have time, we will do a Q&A at the end. What I would encourage you to do, if there are any questions around anything that I cover as we go, please use the chat function. Even if I can't get to those questions straight away, I will be able to respond to those questions after the fact, and we can send a summary of answers out. Also, just a shameless plug that if you do ever have any questions around anything to do with EDI, myself and the rest of the inclusion delivery group, so that's the amazing Ruth, Joy, Caroline, Annie, myself, and Ben. If you ever have any questions around EDI or inclusive practice, we do run a monthly inclusion forum after our sort of monthly event, so you can hang about, and in a space of confidence and confidentiality, you can ask questions around any challenges or barriers yourselves are experiencing, as well as exploring this area of work, which is very fast paced often, so language changes, for example. In terms of realising those aims, I'm going to get you to do most of the heavy lifting. So to begin with, I'm going to put you into a breakout room, and I'm just going to tell you what I want you to discuss. I would like you to discuss with whomever is in the room, why do you want to, or why are you being asked to identify your volunteer diversity profile, and what are the challenges and barriers to that? And this is also an opportunity for you to introduce yourselves, find out where you're located, create connections, networks, and other general cheerleaders. So you have got, for this first bit of work, because it's sort of fundamental really, 15 minutes of conversation time. So 15 minutes of conversation time. We will come back after that point and we'll do a very light touch debrief for those that wish to. So 15 minutes, introduce yourselves, talk about why or you're being asked to, or why you are, and then also what the challenges or barriers of measuring diversity profile for your volunteers. Go. Okay, so I gave you quite a bit of time to discuss the challenges or barriers. I've got 5 slides that I'm going to share with you. I always think it's quite interesting, isn't it, when you go to a course or a workshop and then you end up having to do all the hard work. So please be rest assured that I will give you some content, but I will open it up to the whole group. If anyone does want to say anything around any of their discussions, there is no requirement that you do so, but if there was anything that resonated with yourselves, or you were surprised by or inspired by, feel free to just pop your hand up and say something. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, one of the things we were discussing is that it's quite good to do an annual, like a survey, and it can be simply done like through SurveyMonkey, which is free, a free tool. And if it's done like annual, it can be anonymized, to get the results back, but to ask on various different characteristics, and then to repeat that each year. Yeah, you can see how things change. Yeah.
Good, good, good. Yeah. So what Alex has highlighted is when do we do it and how do we do it? So we're going to have some time to explore that a little bit more. But I absolutely am a clear proponent of using annual surveys, and I'll give you an example of how I use that shortly. Any other reflections from anybody else? I'm taking that 30 seconds of quietness to say no, but there will be a chance for you to feedback shortly. So let me just carry on. So I got you to start thinking about why do you want to, or why have you been asked to identify volunteer diversity profile, and what are the challenges and barriers? So if I just use, I made my slide deck on. So there are a variety of reasons about why you are measuring a diversity profile for your volunteers, and it is really helpful for you to identify which reasons, because that will then inform the approach you take ultimately. So depending on the nature of the volunteer program, if you're being funded externally, there may well be a funder requirement. If there is a funder requirement, it's quite likely they have specific categories, but also ways of asking questions that you may want to adopt for that particular project, so that the funder can readily compare apples with apples rather than apples with pears. It could be an organisational requirement. So you could have an equal opportunities policy, an inclusion policy, however it's termed, that requires anybody that is engaging in either an employment way or a volunteering way to have this type of data gathered as part of an organisation's commitment to inclusion and diversity. You might be wanting to measure diversity so that you can report specifically about representation. And what do I mean by that? You know, if you've got any subcommittees, for example, just as we've just been talking about from an HVG perspective, or if you're doing some very sort of targeted work, you might want to measure the diversity of the individuals. So you can say that actually this is representative, the views are representative, the experience is representative of a particular group. Again, you might want to measure specific participation, and this could be a function, again, of a program that you're running. For example, it could be social prescribing program, and you might want to have particular participation measures that may well take something like measuring disability, for example, and expand it because you want to look at broader or more granular measures of disability or long-term health conditions. It could be that you're measuring it because you need to do a baseline, and that's because either you have no idea where you're coming from, or there is an opportunity for you to try and influence internally because you haven't got currently a diverse volunteer pool. So I would always hope that when you are speaking to leaders or those that are responsible for budget allocation, that they would understand the moral and ethical argument around having a volunteer population that readily reflects and represents the local demographic. Sometimes people don't understand the moral and ethical approach. Sometimes they only understand clearer metrics. And so what you might want to do is do some baseline measurement of your existing volunteer pool or volunteer population to enable you to say very clearly, here is the evidence that we don't have a diverse volunteering pool. That baseline can be really helpful because one, it can identify particular target groups that you want to measure, want to engage with, and that might inform your strategy. But equally, having baseline measures enables you to then measure again for improvement and celebration. I've already mentioned there is sort of good practice and good ethical practice around why you might want to measure diversity. And there may well be, depending on the nature of what you're doing, a legal requirement to do so as well. And then finally, and this is a new kid on the block really, because I was reflecting on this presentation today, is that you might want specific information, especially when you are working and creating more supported or inclusive experiences. So, for example, I run a program called the Inclusive AMA. It's not about volunteers, but I'm using it as an example. As part of that, I get people to fill out something called a This Is Me document that enables them to share with me underlying health issues that would be similar to exploring disability, but without people having to tick a box. Okay, so if you are running social prescribing programs, or you want to make sure that your volunteers are absolutely supported in the best possible way, you might want to think about measuring diversity again in a more granular way. So a variety of reasons why you might measure it, but be clear about why you're measuring it, because that will inform the how, the what, the when. You've already got the why. So I just want to flag code of ethics. I absolutely waggle this whenever I want to influence people to take EDI seriously. If you yourselves have values in your organisations, I would recommend that you play back the values to whomever is, again, in charge of making final decisions. These are all ways of trying to influence change within your organisation, as well as those metrics I've just talked about. The key thing for me is whether you have to or whether you want to. And the reason I've put this slide up is that I think if you feel you have to measure this, the likelihood is you're going to experience increased challenges and barriers because you're going into it not wanting to do it. And therefore, it's going to feel more of a chore, and it's going to feel more complicated, and it's going to feel as if you're not making progress. So, my challenge to all of you, even though you may be feeling you have to do it, try and get behind the wanting to do this for moral and ethical reasons as much as any other reasons, because I guarantee if you want to do it, the barriers and challenges will decrease. So what are those barriers and challenges? I hear you cry. So some of the things that I often hear is around measures. So what are we going to be measuring? And I'll talk about the what's in the later part, but I've already alluded to the fact what you measure very much depends on why you are measuring the volunteer profile. Time, and that's time for you to engage, time for you to analyze. It might also be time for people to complete these questionnaires or surveys, as Alex has just talked through. You might be concerned around how it's going to land, especially if this is the first time you've ever started measuring diversity profiles. So often people are worried that, well, people are thinking I'm being too personal, I'm being too nosy. They might be skeptical about how I'm going to be using it, and they might feel I might be using it to their detriment. Again, so that is often a challenge when you're doing it for the first time. And then other challenges often around, well, where do I keep it? We're all working remotely, or is there a place on the server? And so you may well have had other lists of challenges and barriers. If you have other lists of challenges and barriers, please pop them in the chat function before the end of today's session so I can weave them into the presentation afterwards. Some of the things I would say just to really address these is measures, work out what you're going to measure, because that's about the why. And the time component, only measure what you need to measure. Also, as part of that time component, see if there are any sort of digital tools that might well enable you to decrease the amount of time you're taking, either for people to complete or to analyse. I've talked about the reception, really important whenever you're doing anything around data gathering, that you explain the reasons why, you address any concerns, and appreciate that, the current idea is that, if you start measuring something now around equality, diversity, inclusion, it takes about 5 years for people to think that you're using that data for good. So there's often a 5-year lag where you don't get full data sets, but over those 5 years, you eventually will get a fuller data set. The reality is you're never going to get a full data set, because one of the key components of doing any of this work is ensuring that people know that it's optional overall, and also for individual questions that they can have an option that says prefer not to say. Storage, confidential, access controlled, reminding people of GDPR and also the hierarchies within your organisation around information processes, information commissioners and all of those sort of things, the lead person for data regulation. And I would always include a retention schedule or a line that says this information will be deleted on the 31st of March 2025. Again, depending on the other challenges or barriers you've identified, I can give you some solutions, but please do capture those in the chat function. That would be really, really helpful. So next breakout room, what I would like you to do, and this is a much quicker breakout room, I would like you to look at how you gather this information, if indeed you do, when you gather this information, and what are you gathering. So that comes back to those measures. And I am going to give you just a tiny, slightly less time to do this, because I think some of this may well have already come out as part of the conversation, or you've been reflecting on it as I've been talking. I'm going to give you 7 minutes to do this. So go. Excellent. Thank you very much. We've got 10 minutes to go, and obviously we weren't going to be able to, I could do a whole day on this. This is about giving you enough information to think about what you can do and how you can improve it. So I asked you to think about how, when, what. So how, a diversity questionnaire, so that can be paper-based, online surveys, often have a benefit of being anonymous. Also, you might want to use open text questions. I've used this most recently when I've been asking for some sort of new volunteers without getting them to fill out a diversity questionnaire, because I've made the decision that I don't get people to fill out a diversity questionnaire in detail until they are part and parcel of the program, until they are part and parcel of my volunteer population. But I am interested in finding out whether anybody has any lived experience that they feel would benefit or contribute to their role as a volunteer. So as part of a very light touch application form or expression of interest form. So again, the terminology is really important. I ask an open text question that is there anything from your background or lived experience that you feel would be beneficial to support the volunteering at the Museums Association, for example. So just think about how you do it. When do you do it? So this is ultimately a life cycle of a volunteer, and Alex has already highlighted annual surveying. I absolutely applaud that. That's what I do. I've also just said that I don't get people to fill out anything in detail at the application stage, because there's a real risk that people then don't follow through. So, you know your demographic, you know the volunteer types, you know what's going to land well. I can't tell you that, but you might want to think about sort of pre-application or pre-expression of interest. You might want to, once people have applied and you say, thank you very much, you've applied to be a volunteer for our program, that's great. Would you also mind filling this out? It is optional. It could be, and I know offer is a strange word, but the point at which you are formally engaging them with as a volunteer, you might say at that point, we would really love to have this information, or it could be at a point in the year. But you just need to decide when works for you and your population, and how does it work for that what, or why, I should say, the why. Why are you measuring this? Because the why might dictate when you measure. What about the what? So I've been talking about EDI. This is my second favourite piece of legislation that exists, the Equality Act 2010. And what the Equality Act highlights very clearly is around decreasing discrimination and harassment, increasing fostering good relationships, and it identifies 9 protected groups. And it's those 9 protected groups that are often highlighted when organisations are talking about being either inclusive or representative. So we've got everything from age all the way through to religion and belief. These are just presented in alphabetical order, so that well, no, actually they're not. Sexual orientation, why is that in the wrong place? Excuse me. So the legislation part is important, but you might want to measure other things. So you might want more detailed measures around disability, more granular information if you are running a social a social prescribing program, or if you want to ensure that you put in place reasonable and supportive adjustments for your volunteers. Neurodiversity, you might want to pull that out separately. Often individuals that identify as being neurodiverse may well not see this as a disability, but as a strength. So for some of the paperwork that I use, I pull this out as a separate function. Socioeconomic status, low income households might be something you're interested in, or class. Again, this might very much depend on the funder. You might be interested in care leavers, ex-armed forces, indices of deprivation, first to go to university, carer status, whether individuals are refugees or asylum seekers. There are a whole variety of different things that you may want to measure over and above the standard legal protected groups. So just think about that. You might work for an organisation that wants you to take information less about diversity, but more around marketing segmentation or volunteer motivations. Always good, but I would suggest that if you put them into a diversity measure questionnaire, the likelihood is you're less likely to get people to fill this out, because they may well vote with their feet either way. Like, they might be happy to give you volunteer motivation, but less happy to give you diversity information. Our approach is that we are really, really clear around what our objective for data gathering is. So our aim is to understand current participation and representation. And then we wanted to identify when we are going to ask for what information. And we looked internally to see what was being done for our paid staff to ensure that we were mirroring where we needed to, and we're using consistent language where we needed to. So do use individuals within your organisation to help you. We also were really clear about how we were going to share this data and communicated that up front, and wanted to make sure that we were looking at this information and being able to measure it over time, which is again why we do an annual survey. This is an example, and I'm getting to the end of my slides, you'll be pleased to know, an example of the monitoring form we use for Mentoring for All, which is really granular. But also we highlight on an annual basis. So that's a point of recruitment. Then at an annual basis, we have an online survey. And we also have a slightly different monitoring form for different groups. So I have different approaches depending on my constituents. What we know because of this annual gathering of data is we know for our AMA mentors, which is one of our volunteer programs, we have more women than men, and we have older people than younger people, and we have fewer disabled individuals, and we have fewer museum professionals of colour. So we now know this. So I wouldn't know this if I hadn't been doing my annual surveying. We also do surveying for AMA participants, and whilst they themselves aren't volunteers, again, what's important for me is to highlight the reason we might have this demographic profile is because we've got this demographic profile on our volunteers. So it enables me to engage and influence to extend our approach to try and target particular groups, namely volunteers with disclosed disabilities and long-term health conditions, and volunteers that would identify as being part of the global majority. So what are your next steps? Basically, my worked example is your next step. So reflect on what your objective is for data gathering. Identify when you are going to ask for this data. Look at equivalent measures for paid staff. Work at how you're going to use and share this data and communicate that so people understand there is a benefit in them giving them time and attention. And think about how you are going to communicate all of this to everybody. So over the course of the time before I hand back to Rhiannon now, we have covered quite a bit of space and detail around what we're going to be talking about. This is my summary slide that essentially takes you through all of the other aspects that are important. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rhiannon. If you want copies of the slides, Rhiannon will be sharing these for everybody that's here afterwards with the PDF. But other than that, thank you very much.